Hey, thank you for coming. It is with real pleasure tonight to introduce A.M. Holmes. A.M. is the first time ever we've had a reader here at the Hammer whom I met originally as a student of mine. So it's with pleasure, but also a little bit of pedagogic pride that I introduce A.M. Holmes. She is the author. This is her. May We Be Forgiven. Is her 12th book, which is, in and of itself, for a young person, is a singular achievement. Many of you will have read The Safety of Objects, The Country of Mothers, Things You Should Know. This book will save your life. She even wrote an anthropological book, a social, sort of a cultural anthropology of Los Angeles. A number of you also may have read her book just a few years ago called The Mistress's Daughter, which was a real departure for A.M. It was a story that started, I think I'm right, it started in the New Yorker as a piece you did for the New Yorker. It was a piece of nonfiction that read like fiction. It was an incredible story about finding a young woman who'd been adopted, A.M., who'd been adopted, finding out about her biological parents and meeting them and coming to terms with them. And it was absolutely riveting and disturbing. It was not a sweet story exactly, although it ended with happiness of a sort and love. A.M. is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop. She's had a lot of fellowships, the Guggenheim, the NEA. She's taught everywhere with teaching. She's published everywhere with publishing. And her 12th novel, I think has taken her, I think the departure to a memoir, although it's the word memoir doesn't even seem to apply to A Mistress's Daughter, because it's, I used to feel I didn't like most memoirs until I read Sebald and The Mistress's Daughter. It applies a level of rigor and shape and form that doesn't always come with the memoir form. It doesn't sort of take for granted that everything that happened ought to be in, or that life has to dictate the shape of the piece. It's accurate, it's factual, it's true, but it's shaped as well. And I think the detour into that region of swampy depth gave something to May We Be Forgiven. So here we are, and Michael Cunningham, whom we also had read here, said about A.M.'s vision of family life that she's one of the bravest, most terrifying writers working today. And I know that to be true. So please let's welcome A.M. Holmes.
Thank you very, very much. It's always a treat to be at the Hammer. I think of it as one of my, if New York is the hometown that I adopted, then Los Angeles is the next hometown, if you have two hometowns. I love being out here, and obviously I keep writing about it because I'm sort of mesmerized by it. This is a novel that started as a short story and then turned into 600 pages, and I don't really know how that happened. It's like I went into some sort of trance and I woke up many, many years later, much older, and then the publisher said to me, "What about chapters?" I thought, like, chapters? I hadn't stopped typing long enough to even think about chapters, so I just put little dents wherever I could. So I'm going to read to you a little bit from the beginning, and then Mona and I are going to talk about all kinds of things, I guess. May we be forgiven. An incantation, a prayer, the hope that somehow I come out of this alive. Was there ever a time you thought, I'm doing this on purpose? I'm fucking up and I don't know why? Do you want my recipe for disaster? The warning sign. Last year, Thanksgiving at their house, 20 or 30 people at tables spreading from the dining room into the living room, stopping abruptly at the piano bench. He was at the head, picking turkey out of his teeth, talking about himself. I kept watching him as I went back and forth carrying plates into the kitchen, the edges of my finger dipping into unnameable goo, cranberry, sweet potato, cold pearl onion, gristle. With every trip back and forth from the dining room to the kitchen, I hated him more. Every sin of our childhood, beginning with his birth, came back. He entered the world 11 months after me, sickly at first, and was given far too much attention. And then, despite what I repeatedly tried to tell him about how horrible he was, he acted as though he believed he was a gift of the gods. They named him George. Geo, he liked to be called. Like that was something cool, something scientific, mathematical, analytical. Geode, I called him, like a sedimentary rock. By the time we were 10 and 11, he was taller than me, broader, stronger. "Are you sure he's not the butcher's boy?" my father would ask jokingly. No one laughed. I was bringing in heavy plates and platters, casseroles caked with the debris of dinner, and no one noticed that help was needed. Not George, not his 2 children, not his awful friends who were in fact in his employ. Among them a weather girl and assorted spare anchor men and women who sat stiff back and hairsprayed like Ken and Barbie. And not my Chinese-American wife, Claire, who hated turkey and never failed to remind us that her family used to celebrate with roast duck and sticky rice. George's wife, Jane, had been at it all day, cooking, cleaning, serving, and was now scraping bones into a giant trash bin. Jane scoured the plates, piling dirty dishes one on top of the other and dropping the silver into a sink of steamy water. Glancing at me, she brushed her hair away with the back of her hand and smiled. I went back for more. I looked at their children and imagined them dressed as pilgrims in black buckle shoes doing pilgrim children chores like carrying buckets of milk like oxen. Nathaniel, 12, and Ashley, 11, sat like lumps at the table, hunched, or more like curled as if poured into their chairs, truly spineless, eyes focused on their small screens, the only thing in motion their thumbs, one texting friends no one had ever seen, the other killing digitized terrorists. In the background, 2 televisions loudly competed among themselves for no one's attention, one featuring football and the other the film Mighty Joe Young. "You know, I'm a company man, heart and soul," George says. "I'm the network's president of entertainment. I am ever aware, 24/7. There is a television in every room. The fact is, George can't bear to be alone, not even in the bathroom. The turkey platter was at the center of the table, and I reached over my wife's shoulder and lifted. The tray was heavy and wobbled, and I willed myself to stay strong and was able to carry out the mission while balancing a casserole of Brussels sprouts in the crook of my other arm. The turkey, an heirloom bird, whatever that means, had been rubbed, relaxed, herbed into submission, into thinking it wasn't so bad to be decapitated and stuffed up the ass with breadcrumbs and cranberries and an annual rite. The bird had been raised with a goal in mind, an actual date when his number would come up. I stood in their kitchen picking at the carcass while Jane did the dishes, her bright blue gloves on, up to her elbows in suds. My fingers were deep in the bird, hollow in the body, still warm, the best bits of stuffing packed in. I dug with my fingers and brought stuffing to my lips. Jane looked at me, my mouth moist, my fingers curled into what would have been the turkey's G-spot if they had such things. She lifted her hands out of the water and came towards me to plant one on me, not friendly. The kiss was serious, full of desire. It was terrifying and unexpected. She did it, then snapped off her gloves and walked out of the room. I was holding the counter, gripping it with greasy fingers, hard. Dessert was served. Jane asked if anyone wanted coffee and went back into the kitchen, and I followed her like a dog, wanting more. She ignored me. "Are you ignoring me?" I asked. She said nothing and then handed me the coffee. "Could you let me have a little pleasure, a little something that's just for myself?" She paused. "Cream and sugar?" From Thanksgiving through Christmas and on into the New Year, all I thought of was George fucking Jane. George on top of her for special occasion, George on the bottom, and once, fantastically, George having her from the back, his eyes fixed on a wall-mounted television, the ticker tape of news trickling across the bottom of the screen. I couldn't stop thinking about it. I was convinced that despite his charms, his excess of professional achievement, George wasn't very good in bed. All he knew about sex he'd learned from the pages of magazines read furtively while shitting. I thought of my brother fucking his wife constantly. It begins again. It's almost 9 on an evening towards the end of February when Jane calls. Claire is still at the office. She's always at the office. Another man would think his wife was having an affair. I just think Claire is smart. "I need your help," Jane says. "Don't worry," I say, before I even know what the worry is. "He's at the police station. There's some kind of a problem." I glance at the New York skyline. "Did he do something wrong?" "Apparently. They want me to come get him. Can you go and pick your brother up?" "Don't worry," I say, repeating myself. A fight. On the way to the police station, that's what I'm thinking. George has it in him, a kind of atomic reactivity that stays under the surface until something triggers him and he erupts, throwing over a table, smashing his fist through the wall. More than once, I've been the recipient of his frustrations. A baseball hurled at my back, striking me at kidney level. A push backwards through a full-length pane of glass as George blocks me from getting the last of the brownies. I imagine he went out for a drink after work and got on the wrong side of someone. 33 minutes later, I park outside a small suburban police station, a white cake box circa 1970. I'm here on behalf of George Silver. You're the brother? Yes. We called his wife. She's coming to get him. Well, she called me, so I'm here to pick him up. We wanted to take him to the hospital, but he wouldn't go. He kept repeating he's a dangerous man and we should take him downtown and lock him up. Personally, I think the man needs a doctor. You don't walk away from something like that unscathed. So he got into a fight? Car accident, bad one. Doesn't appear he was under the influence. Passed a breath test, consented to urine. He really should see a doctor. Was it his fault? He ran a red light and plowed into a minivan. The husband was killed on impact. The wife, alive at the scene in the back seat. The rescue crews used the jaws of life to free her. Upon release, she expired. Her legs fell out of the car. Someone calls from the back office. The boy's in fair condition. He'll survive. Your brother's in back. I'll get him. Is my brother being charged with a crime? Not at the moment. There'll be a full investigation. The officer noted he appeared disoriented at the scene. Take him home. Get him a doctor, a lawyer. These things can get ugly. George comes out disheveled. Why are you here? He asks. Jane called, and besides, you had the car. She could have taken a taxi. It's late. I lead George through the small parking lot and into the night, feeling compelled to take his arm, to guide him by his elbow, not sure if I'm preventing him from escaping or just steadying him. Either way, George doesn't pull away. He lets himself be led. Where's Jane? He asks. At the house. Does she know? I shake my head, no. It was awful, he says. There was a light. Did you see the light? I think I may have seen it, but it was like it didn't make sense. Like it didn't apply to you, George? Like I didn't know. He gets into the car. Where's Jane, he asks again. At the house, I repeat. Buckle your belt. Pulling into the driveway, the headlights cut through the house and catch Jane in the kitchen, holding a pot of coffee. Are you all right? She asks when we're inside. How could I be? George says. He empties his pockets onto the kitchen counter. He takes off his shoes, his socks, his pants, his boxers, his shirt, his jacket, his undershirt, and stuffs it all into the kitchen trash can. Would you like some coffee? Jane asks. Naked, George stands with his head tilted as if he's hearing something. Coffee? She asks again, gesturing with the pot. He doesn't answer. He walks from the kitchen through the dining room and into the living room and sits in the dark, naked, in a chair. Did he get into a fight? Jane asks me. Car accident. You better call your insurance company and your lawyer. Do you have a lawyer? George, do we have a lawyer? Do I need one? If I do, call Rakowski. There's something wrong with him, Jane says. He killed people. There's a pause. She pours George a cup of coffee and brings it into the living room, along with a dish towel that she drapes over his genitals, like putting a napkin in his lap. The phone rings. Don't answer it, George says. Hello, Jane says. I'm sorry, he's not home right now. May I take a message? Jane listens. Yes, I hear you. Perfectly clear. She hangs up. Do you want a drink? She asks no one in particular, and then pours one for herself. Who was it? I ask. Friend of the family, she says, and clearly she means the family that was killed. For a long time, George sits in the chair, the dish towel shielding his privates, the cup of coffee daintily on his lap. Beneath him, a puddle forms. George, Jane implores when she hears the sound like water dripping. You're having an accident. Tessie, the old dog, gets up from her bed, comes over and sniffs it. Jane hurries into the kitchen and comes back with a wad of paper towels. It'll eat the finish right off the floor, she says. Through it all, George looks blank, like the empty husk left by a reptile who shed his skin. Jane takes the cup of coffee from George and hands it to me. She takes the wet towel from his lap, helps him to stand, and wipes the back of his legs and his ass with paper towels. Let me help you, upstairs. I watch as they climb the steps. I see my brother's body slack, his stomach sagging slightly, the bones of his hips, his pelvis, his flat ass, all so white they appear to glow in the dark. As they climb, I see below his ass and tucked between his legs, his low purplish sack swaying like an old lion. I sit on their couch. Where is my wife? Isn't Claire curious to know what happened? Doesn't she wonder why I'm not home? The room smells like urine. There are wet paper towels on the floor. Jane doesn't come back, so I clean up and sit on the sofa. I'm staring through the dark at an old wooden tribal mask. I'm staring at this unfamiliar face that Nate brought back from a school trip to South Africa, and the mask seems to be staring back as though inhabited, wanting to say something. I hate this living room. I hate this house. I want to go home. I text Claire and explain what happened, and she writes back, I took advantage of your being gone, and I'm still at the office. It sounds like you should stay the night in case things deteriorate. Dutifully, I sleep on the sofa with a small blanket covering my shoulders. Tessie, the dog, joins me, warming my feet. In their morning, there are hurried phone calls and hushed conversations. A copy of the accident report crawls out of the fax machine. George, Jane says clearly, we have to go to the hospital. Pack your bags. And he does. I drive them. George sits next to me wearing well-worn corduroy pants and a flannel shirt he's had for years. He's unevenly shaved. I drive self-consciously, worried his complacent mood might shift, that he might flash back, erupt, and try to grab the wheel. The seatbelts are good. They discourage sudden movements. Simple Simon met a pieman going to the fair. Said Simple Simon to the pieman, let me taste your ware. George intones, Simple Simon went a-fishing for to catch a whale. All the water he has got was in his mother's pail. Watch out, he says to me. You'll get what you asked for. Do you know why you're here? A doctor asks him. I've got bad aim, George says. Any history of mental or neurological problems? The doctor asks. We all shake our heads. Why don't you leave him with us for now? We'll order some tests, the doctor says, and then we'll talk further. Again, I stay the night at George and Jane's house. Skipping forward, it's a very long book. It's 200 and some thousand words, not that I counted. It's funny how quickly something becomes a routine, a way of doing business. I stay with Jane, and it's as though we're playing house. I take out the trash, lock the door, she makes a snack, and asks if I'll come upstairs. We watch television and read. I read whatever it was that George had been reading, his newspapers and magazines, the big history of Thomas Jefferson that sits on her side of the bed. The accident happens, and then it happens. It doesn't happen the night of the accident or the night we all visit. It happens the night after that. The night after Claire tells me not to leave Jane alone. The night after Claire leaves for China. Claire goes on her trip, George goes downhill, and then it happens. It's the thing that was never supposed to happen. The evening visit to the hospital goes badly. George is locked in a padded room, his arms bound to his body, and Jane and I take turns peering in through a small window. Jane asks to go in and see him, and the nurse cautions her against it, but she insists. Jane goes to him, calls his name. George looks up at her, and she sweeps his hair out of his face and wipes his furrowed brow, and then he turns on her, pins her with his body, and bites her again and again, her face, her neck, her hands. The aides rush in and pull George off of Jane. She's taken downstairs and treated in the emergency room. Her wounds are cleaned and dressed, and she's given some sort of a shot, like a rabies vaccination. We go back to the house, and Jane heats 100-calorie brownies in the microwave, and I scoop non-fat ice cream onto them. She sprays them with 0-calorie whipped cream, and I cheer them further with chocolate sprinkles. We snack in silence. I take out the trash and change out of my clothes, the same clothes I've been wearing for days, and put on a pair of his pajamas. I hug her. I want to be comforting. I'm in his pajamas. I don't think anything will happen. I apologize, I say, without knowing what I'm saying, and then she is against me. She puts her hands on the side of her skirt and slides it down. There was a time when I almost told Claire about Thanksgiving. In fact, I tried to tell her one night when we were feeling close. I started to tell the story, and Claire sat straight up, and I pulled the sheet tight against her body, and I backed away from what I was about to say. I changed it. I left out the kiss and just mentioned something about Jane brushing against me. You were in her way, Claire says. I don't mention that I felt the head of my cock pressing against my sister-in-law's hips. Only you would think she was making a pass, Claire said. Only me, I repeated. Only me. Jane pulls me towards her. Her hips are narrow. She's on me, and I'm thinking this isn't really going to happen, is it? She strokes me, looking me in the eye, and there's no way to say no. There's more, but I'm not going to read all that out loud. I have family. This is how you make more family. There's a terrible joke. It's not just in jokes. In the middle of writing this book, which took years, I took an improv class, And it's not funny, because I think it's actually ruined my ability to read this book out loud, because I keep stopping along the way and then I start telling jokes, which is just so not right. Hold on a second. Drenched in her scent, but too shaken to shower or fall asleep in their bed, I wait until Jane is asleep, and then I go downstairs to the kitchen. I wash myself with dish soap. I'm in my brother's kitchen at 3 a.m, soaping my cock at his sink, drying myself with a towel that says "Home Sweet Home." It happens again in the morning when she finds me on the sofa, then again in the afternoon after we visit George. "What's the story with your hand?" George asks Jane the next day, noticing the bandages. He's back in his room with no memory of the night before. Jane starts to cry. "You look like hell," he says. "Get some rest." "It's been a difficult time," I say. That evening we open a bottle of wine and do it again, more slowly, deliberately, intentionally. The hospital lets him out, or more likely he simply decides to leave. Inexplicably, George is able to walk out unnoticed in the middle of the night. He comes home in a taxi, using money he's found wrinkled at the bottom of his pocket. He can't find his keys, so he rings his bell, and the dog barks. Maybe I heard that part, the dog barking. Or maybe George didn't ring the bell, and maybe the dog didn't bark. Maybe George took a spare key from under the mat, or from inside the fake rock in the garden by the door, and like an intruder, he came silently into his own house. Maybe he came upstairs thinking he'd crawl into his bed, but his spot was taken. I don't know how long he stood there. I don't know how long he waited before he lifted the lamp from her side of the bed and smashed it onto her head. That's when I woke up. She's screaming. The one blow isn't enough. She tries to get up. The lamp isn't even broken. George looks at me and then picks the lamp up again and swings it at her. The porcelain vase that is the base explodes against her head. By then I'm out of bed. He tosses aside what remained of the lamp. There's blood streaming down his fingers, picks up the phone and throws it to me. "Call it in," he says. I stand facing George, wearing his pajamas. We're the same, like mimes. We have the same gestures, the same faces, the family chin. I'm staring at him, not knowing how this is going to work out. An awful gurgling sound prompts me to dial the phone. Accidentally, I drop the phone. I bend to pick it up, and my brother's foot catches me under the chin, kicking me hard, and my head snaps back. I'm down as George leaves the room. I see his hospital gown under his clothes hanging out like some kind of a tail. I hear George's heavy footfall as he goes down the stairs. I reach across the floor and pull the phone towards me and dial O. I dial O like it's a hotel, like I expect someone to answer. There's a long recording, a kind of spoken word essay about what the O button can do for you. And I realize it will be forever before a real person comes on. I hang up, and after several shaky attempts, I'm able to dial 911. "A woman has been beaten. Hurry," I say, and give them the address. I pull myself to stand and go into the bathroom and get a washcloth, so that will help. It takes forever. The fire truck comes first. The house shakes as it pulls up. I leave Jane and go to the window. They come across the grass in full fire gear, hats and coats, immune to the pre-dawn spray of the irrigation system. I don't know if they open the door or if he opens the door. They come in of their own accord. "Upstairs," I shout. Quickly they are upon her. One stands apart, talking as if narrating into his radio. "A middle-aged woman, head injury, exposed matter, bring a longboard, full air, medic bag, request police support." "Who is this woman?" the narrator asks. "Jane, my brother's wife." "Relevant medical information, allergies, underlying conditions?" "Does Jane have any medical problems?" I shout down. "A lamp hit her on the head," George says. The paramedics slip an orange board under Jane and tape her to it with what looks like duct tape and wrap her head in gauze. She looks like a mummy, a battle casualty, or maybe a Shriner en route to a convention. Jane makes a noise, a low guttural growl, as they lift him up and carry her out, leaving a trail of sterile debris and heavy footprints. Turning the corner, they knock into the banister, and with a crack, it snaps. They're out the kitchen door and into the back of the ambulance faster than you might think. George is in the kitchen, drinking a cup of coffee. There's blood on his hands, flecks of something on his face, pieces of lamp, shards. "No parking on the grass," he says to the first police officer who arrives. "Inform your troops." "Which one of you is Mr. Silver?" the cop asks. I assume he must be a detective because he's not wearing a uniform. We both raise our hands simultaneously. "I am." "We're brothers," I say. "I'm the elder." "So who did what to whom?" He got his notebook out. George sips his coffee. I say nothing.
Funny, I had vowed recently to get a higher shoes because I was at a literary party in New York, and it was one of those stand-up parties, and I noticed that a lot of people were bending down to talk to me. But this is the downside. So can you
That's the shrinking of publishing.
So tell us about the genesis of this book for you.
This book started, this big accident. No, you know, it's funny. It comes from three different places. And one is that I've been thinking a lot about brothers. And I'd written a little bit about brothers in the last novel, and then in a short story I did for the painter Eric Fischel. And I weirdly was thinking about John Cheever's brother a lot, Fred. And that's
Goodbye, my brother.
Exactly. And Falconer, and
Yeah.
that's the literary sort of genesis. And then Zadie Smith was doing this anthology for Dave Eggers, and she said, will you write a piece for it? So I said, of course. And she said, it's got to be about two characters. So I thought, oh, brothers. And I started typing and typing and typing, and I didn't finish. And then I said, I'm really sorry. And I had to give them something else. And I was typing and typing, and then finally I sort of finished what I thought was the short story, and I thought that's enough. And Granta ran that, and then all of a sudden I was still typing in that horrible way, and you just think, what are you doing? You finished the story. And it's like, you know, and you're in a fight with yourself in some weird way. And then then I also thought, well, if you do that to somebody on the beginning of a book, if you hit someone on the head with a lamp, what do you do after that? You know, seriously. And it's like you have to raise the stakes in some way.
Well, the pace at the beginning is so fast as well.
Yeah, it's exhausting.
So was it pretty? It sort of sounds like you wrote it in one sweep. Is that
7-year sweep. It was
a 7-year sweep?
Yeah.
So how would you describe that?
slow writer.
How much did you revise? How much did you
Well,
go back over things? Because
I
7
mean-
years, you figure it can't be a sweep.
no, it felt like it though. I mean, you know, it is a long book, and it goes into all these crazy things like Richard Nixon and all these crazy digressions. I revise a lot. I mean, it's that process, and I do this funny thing where I try to keep not every draft, but all the major drafts. And basically, you can't find the floor in my the little room I work in. It's just covered with enormous piles of paper, and I keep thinking now what do I do with them? You know, do I burn them or do I just rent a storage unit? But because I have to print everything out, I have to write on. You know, it's the usual stuff. At a certain point, I started writing longhand by pencil.
How important is comedy to you?
Comedy. Apparently it's very important. You know, I think that the thing is that the things that I'm talking about are clearly very serious, and
Yeah.
I think in order to really buy the space to kind of talk about serious things, you also have to be funny, because otherwise it's just too painful.
That's a good
I mean,
point.
I think life is hard, and if you can't find the humor in it, then it's 10 times harder. You know, so I think as I get older, I'm just funnier and funnier.
That's a very
I'm
good
going to be doing
thing.
stand-up at 80. It'll actually sit down. It'll be sit-down comedy. What am I thinking?
Can you talk a little bit about your development? Because you've changed. You're writing. Ann Holmes is really a writer. Your work. You definitely have a recognizable voice, but your work has changed over the years. There's no question.
I think so. I mean, I like to think it's got better. You know, I actually sold my first novel when I was in Mona's class at NYU, much to the annoyance of everybody in the class. I had started writing it when I was 19, so it took a long time.
I don't think that's true.
Oh, I do. I do. We'll talk about that later, but anyway, there were some people who were not happy.
I remember it all much more sweetly.
I know, that's nice, I'm glad. No, exactly. I just use that for more material later. But no, I think, you know, I started writing when I was very, very young, and I think that there is a kind of naivete to that early work that in a way I wish I still had and I wish I could get, but it does change. And I guess the biggest shift for me has been, it's funny to say, like, you know, I wrote this crazy book called The End of Alice about the jailed pedophile murderer that got banned in lots of places. Not weirdly in this country, but all over Europe it became kind of a thing. And it's interesting because I really wrote that. It's a very, very dark book. It makes this look entirely like an Archie comic. But I really wrote it trying to prompt the discussion of how do we as a society deal with things like child abuse? And the pedophile basically says, if I'm in jail, then why are these things still happening? So it was really about provoking a conversation, a serious conversation. But I think after that book, which was very, very dark and hard to be in that mindset, I started thinking more about how does one write optimistically at a time in history that's not inherently optimistic? And I think that came from, at a certain point, becoming a parent and trying to think about how do you raise a child, again, in this world it's a very complicated place. So I think that's like the biggest sort of, and it's funny because it's not really that different from the first book in the sense of Jack, who's this young boy trying to deal with his family and his dad being gay, which he finds out, and how it sort of undoes him, and then realizing what family's all about. And in a way, this is, I mean, it's not the same book, but it's very much also a book about family and making a family for yourself.
You do take on some of the big themes, like how a society deals with pedophilia. How much research do you do to take on something like that?
I do
What sorts
enormous amounts of research. I came out here to do the Nixon thing. I came out here, went to Yorba Linda, to the Nixon Library. I mean, I both love research, but even, when I was writing This Book Will Save Your Life, which is set in Los Angeles, I mean, I'll do everything from literally reading about what the indigenous plants are, because my feeling is if you're not, especially if a place is not entirely native to you, or an experience or a mindset, in order for me to really get into it and write, and I really do write fiction, I mean, it's not based on my own life, I have to understand it literally from like the plant life up, which is annoying, but it's, I know a lot about bougainvillea, if anyone's interested, And I know a lot actually about architecture of prisons, the history of the penitentiary. And then weirdly, it's like I sometimes feel like I must have started doing the research early because in college I took a course in prison survival. And I'm thinking, was that because I was thinking I was going at some point? I don't know what why? I mean, why does someone in their 20s study like prison survival? It was all like guards and me. Hi guys, here we are again. The class was at 6 in the morning so they could still make it to work on time.
Oh, that's funny.
And I took it, I have a cousin who's actually now the head of all discipline in the federal prison system, and she was taking the
head
class.
of all discipline?
Yeah, she's the
Really?
one who, she said, the other night I saw her in Washington, she said she had, we were talking about things she's gotten to listen in on, which is things like Martha Stewart's phone calls from prison. She said Martha's not as nice as she pretends to be. Surprise! Yeah, but she's the head of all discipline in the
Wow.
federal system.
Did you follow the expose last year in the New York Review of Books on the prison system?
No.
It was really good.
I must have been writing.
It was
Really?
a
Yeah, I should,
a four-part series. Really
Really?
good. Yeah, really horrifying and
I should, I love that. I mean,
no, absolutely upsetting. Do you have you begun to work on your next book?
I agreed, weirdly, I mean, I'm going to write a book of short stories, or I have been writing a book of short stories. I feel like sometimes after a novel, especially one that's 200,000 words, one has to rest a moment. And being that I can't possibly rest because I don't know how, that means writing short stories. And then I agreed, the Swiss philosopher Alain de Botton has commissioned 6 of us to go into large-scale institutions. He went into Heathrow and was a writer in residence there and wrote this book sort of about the relationship of individuals to these big institutions. So Alexander Hemon went into the United Nations and someone went into the International Monetary Fund. And I've been watching brain surgery, literally. I've been like in the operating room at New York Hospital thinking this is going to teach me how a hospital works. And it's been incredibly fun and interesting. And then it's becoming a problem when there's like a bad scrub nurse and the doctor says, I need the patties. A patty is actually, it's like a piece of gauze with dental floss on it and a number. And that's the things you don't want to get left inside you. And he's like, I need a patty. And the nurse is like, look at him like, because you start realizing you know all the pieces and all the parts. And it's fascinating. So I've been doing that.
Oh, that sounds
Yeah.
exciting. How long will you be in residence?
Well, I'm excited. Watch out. I was there most of September, and I'm going to probably go back, and I'm going to move up to the heart transplant area and do some of that, and then I'm going to do a few other things. And I'm truly trying to figure out how to write about it, because I've been talking to, the one thing I think is interesting is they won't let me go to the morgue, and I actually wanted to start with that, because I thought, the truth is that's your biggest fear. I mean, why do, you don't go to the hospital on a great day in your life. You go there when something's going on, and you basically are terrified you're going to die. So it's interesting, and I've had a lot of really interesting conversations with people. A young woman who had an aneurysm and survived, and then other people talking about like end-of-life decisions for infants. I mean, really very, very intense stuff. But I love it. It's not funny though, and I can't make it funny because that would be like horrible, really. But I like it. I find it interesting. I always wanted to sort of be a doctor, maybe part-time.
Well, that's more or less what you're doing now. You're sort of being
I am. Yeah.
exciting. So next to short stories, and you haven't gotten an inkling yet of the next major project, or the next longer project.
No, I think, it really, for me, it comes a lot out of kind of reading the culture. And it's funny, this book has a lot of things in it that in the past I wouldn't have wanted to put in a novel, like the use of technology and the kinds of things that in a way I worry can date something over time. But I also was very interested in how technology in the last, probably 5 years has truly changed our lives. And even the idea that somehow, we are this one person when we're with our sort of families or in our work lives, and then very often people have almost like another persona in their intimate chats with other people and all these sorts of things, and trying to not exactly reconcile it, but to begin to kind of illustrate those splits within a person, I felt was sort of important and interesting. So there's things in there that I hadn't really wanted to deal with in the past. And I think, in terms of what comes next, I'm really, I don't know, I think the election will depend a lot on, what I write next. A.M. Holmes. I don't know.
Funny.
I think it will, because I really am just always looking, out to see what's happening.
God, I was thinking today, is there ever been anything major in fiction written about American electoral, like voting? Has there ever been? Can
A good
anyone think
novel
of a
about
scene?
voting?
No, I mean a scene of
Yeah.
voting. It's,
No, there really hasn't.
it's kind
No,
of interesting.
it is interesting, and I think it's, on a very serious level, I think in some ways, we don't deal with those things that well in fiction. On the one hand, fiction is very good at kind of telling the truth that's hard to otherwise tell, but I think in terms of sort of taking apart large cultural sort of structures, it's not that great.
Well, when you look at the landscape of American fiction now, where do you think we're succeeding and where do you think we're failing?
Well, I think that, the success part is really interesting, because every few years I do these things, and I'm sure you do them a lot, but where you end up reading a bunch of books for either an award or a contest. And it's really, when you do something like judge the National Book Award, you read like 357,000, you read about 350 books that they send to you kind of all at once. And it's really interesting to see like a year in fiction,
Yeah.
or when you read, the novels of the under 35, which I always describe as the best American writers not yet born. But it is really interesting, because you begin to see that there are many more stories written by people who've come from other countries. There are many more kinds of voices and ways of stories being told. I think one of the things that's really interesting is like whether it's like Seybold or Mark Danielewski's work, there is a kind of a shattering in some ways of the conventional narrative that used to be sort of abhorrent in popular culture. Like people couldn't stand that, and now people have some better sense of how to navigate that. So I think it's an interesting time. It's hard to know exactly. I think publishing itself it's a problem. It has changed profoundly.
And where do you think we're failing as writers?
Well, I was doing a little bit of homework the other day about something, and I was looking back at, because I was thinking about the literary seeds of this novel, and I was looking back at Joseph Heller's Catch-22. So this is a sort of a sales figure, but when it came out in 1961, it sold 30,000 copies. Now, if you look at the number, the way the population has grown since then, you should be selling, I don't know what, like millions of copies, and 30,000 copies now would be a big bestseller for a literary novel. That would do well.
No.
Well,
No.
well, I don't. Well,
Unfortunately, no. Not 30. I don't think.
oh yeah, it would. Well, publishing people are here. I think 30
Not a
you would
total
get
of
on
30. If you sold 30 in the first month, for sure.
I don't know. The numbers are bleak. Anyway, and it sold 10 million copies in paperback, and I think
10 million copies.
Yeah,
Wow.
Yeah.
No, it is true though. What you're saying, we might be quibbling over the numbers, but it's absolutely true. When we were growing up, what educated household did not have the new Philip Roth novel? Every
Right.
single one. Just the week it was published, it was there.
Right.
And there's just not that level of permeation. But has that just moved? Has every educated household now seen The Wire? Is it just changed form?
I don't know. I think TV is actually has become a very interesting form, but I don't really know. The other thing too, I think about it. young people, I mean, I used to grow up thinking I wanted to work as an editor, I wanted to work in publishing. Nobody wants to work as an editor now. In fact, the same people are the same editors. No one's left since we started. I mean,
That's true that no one's left.
It's
but
like classical music.
I don't
You
know.
go
I
and you're
have
still the
students
youngest
who are
person.
trying to get hired, so there are still some kids who
Yeah,
are
but
trying to.
I mean, it's different. It's very
not as
different.
jazzy. I think that's true.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, I think, yes, part of it has changed, and we are shifting to becoming, in a way, a much more visual culture. But, the thing is that the act of reading and the way that one participates in the reading of a book is not replaced by watching TV, And the fact is, when you're reading a book, you make those people come alive. You give them their intonation, you give them their tone, you actually draw them. So everybody, would draw each character differently. I mean, in this book, Harry, people keep saying, what does Harry look like? He gets a lot of girls. And I think it's so funny. I think, I have no idea what Harry looks like. I sort of do. But everyone's Harry is different. And that's very different
that's
than
a lovely thing about reading, isn't it? It's a great thing.
Yeah.
It makes more demands on the reader.
Well, you participate in it. And I think that's the real thing, is that reading requires the participation of, the reader, and it's a very intimate act, and you generally do it by yourself. And television is a much more, in a way, a passive thing. You can't read a book and leave the room, and still come back and it's still going. Okay, that's the first thing. Wouldn't that be terrifying? No, you're here now. It's like,
you skip 5 pages.
Yeah.
I'll fill you in.
Yeah, I mean, literally, you are the engine. The reader is the engine that propels the book, and makes a lot of decisions about how to participate in it. And the other things are all, kind of much more larger social things and much more communal. I don't know. It's.
Now, have you been living in New York?
I have been living in New York. I'm
consistently?
still living at NYU. No, I live on Washington Square Park, but the class that we took, I live like 4 feet
nice.
from there. Yeah, I'm the third bench on the left.
That's very funny. And how is your daily life? How do you work your day?
Painful.
Work your writing into?
I have the kid.
How old is the kid?
The kid is now 9, which is, I keep telling people, like, I gained weight when I was pregnant, and I'm like, waiting. And they go, how old is the baby? I'm like, 9. So, I'm sure it'll come off at some point.
4th grade 9 or 3rd grade 9?
4th grade 9.
Fourth grade.
A very immature 4th grade 9. But anyway, so, I used to, and when I go, like, to a writer's colony, which is, of course, less than I used to, I like to, the truth is, I like to get up around 6:30 in the morning and just start writing. Now I get up at 6:30. It's like, hi, Mom. Move over. It's like, okay. So there goes the best part of my writing day right there. And so after everything else, and walking the dog and feeding the hamster, and fortunately the frogs died over the summer.
That is fortunate.
It is. One of Mr. Mutant had an extra arm out of the middle of his chest. Anyway, but growafrog.com. And I called them and I said, the frog has this extra arm. And they go, well, do you want another one? I was like, another one what? Another arm to go with it? Or whatever. It was horrible. But anyway, so I go to work every day. I mean, I really, I'm not happy or comfortable if I'm not writing. And so even if I'm writing a novel, I'm also usually writing some other things too, because God forbid I get stuck for 5 minutes. I just have to write an article just to
And it's nice to finish things.
It's really nice to finish things, especially when novels take a long time. So I like doing different things. And I think also the truth is I'm not really a person who likes to be alone for years at a time.
That's unfortunate given your career choice.
I know, it is. So, you get these funny phone calls. It's like, do you want to have lunch with Vanessa Redgrave? And you think, sure, why not? And then you realize 3 more weeks of your life will go into that lunch. Oops. But yeah, I like doing it. And the truth is I like writing, and I really, really more and more love writing fiction. By contrast to writing nonfiction and the memoir I was very concerned with trying to get things factually accurate. I think
you did a lot of research, even outside your own family.
Yes,
story.
I did tons of research, but I felt like, it was sort of not long after James Fry's episode,
Fiasco.
whatever you want exactly. And so I really was thinking a lot about the difference between fact and fiction. I think somebody who really does make things up all the time, I'm very aware of what is a fact. So I felt like it was important to be accurate, and then also if I was adding something to say, I imagine that to make it clear that I was not being factual. So to finish that and then go back into fiction was just like, I get to party. Yeah, but I did a ton of research. Like, there's a lot of Nixon stuff in there, and it's based really heavily in fact, except for his novels and short stories, which I did make up, based on his life, of course. Yeah.
That's very funny. Okay, well, I have lots more questions, but I should, at this point, open it up to the audience.
What are you reading for your own pleasure, not for a contest or for work?
Not to give a prize to. There's a wonderful book of short stories that just came out called, I think it's, I really have to learn the title. I think it's The News from Spain, by a woman named Joan Wickersham, who wrote a book called The Suicide Index, and it's really just incredibly finely written. So I'm enjoying reading that. There's another short story writer named Brad Watson, who I think is just an incredible short story writer who's not that well known. I'll read, I like science a lot, so a good book about a black hole. I love that. Time warps. I read all kinds of things. I'm really, I don't know, it's very, very eclectic. I like biographies a lot. I always like to see how other people live, or just how to live would be a good example. Yeah, very odd group of things.
Kind of a basic question. What goes into your decision whether to write first person or third person?
That's a very good question. I have no idea. I mean, I think I guess for me, when you're writing first person, I think that the story is both limited and enhanced by the kind of boundaries of what that means. So I tend to, in the last few years, write what I would think of as a very close third person that's got a lot of dialogue in it. But I don't know, it's the weirdest thing. The truth is, I don't think about stuff like that. I really mostly think a lot about what is the story I'm trying to tell and who's in it. I had this, besides Mona, I had a great writing teacher named Grace Paley. And Grace talked a lot about writing the truth according to the character. And that very much informs what I do, is thinking what's accurate for this person. And beyond that, I don't think about it. I mean, it has to sort of, I think of it, the closest answer would be to say it's almost like a piece of music, and I think what is the right pitch for it, and you have to kind of start off at that right note, because the truth is if you're off key or you go the wrong way, then I think it falls all, into a sort of a mess.
Thanks. This is along the same lines. Writing first person as a man, a male perspective, did you do research on that? Did you did you run it by friends who, male friends saying, does this sound like a man?
Well, I have had the habit of writing in a male voice for a very long time. And I just really adore men, and I have a lot of male friends. The running joke is like, I had a birthday not that long ago, and it was like 18 men and me. And I was like, what? I mean, I don't even notice in the funniest way. I think the only time I sort of noticed was that when I actually had a child, and then a few friends dumped me, guy friends. I thought, oh God, they found out I'm a girl. I'm convinced that that's really what it was. I was like, oh, she turned into a girl, like, get rid of her. I think, I think about it a lot, and the truth is, I think for me to write from a female point of view is harder, and it's actually excruciating, because I almost feel like it's like too close, and I can't bear it. I can't bear what I actually know, and would just be, you see how like mean I can be to, like, in that voice, just imagine what would happen. I don't want to do it. I never really articulated that before, but there you have it. And I think the thing also that it's like the last novel, we got this quote from Stephen King, and everyone's like, you got Stephen King to blurb your book. And I thought, the coolest thing to me was that he was a guy about the same age as the narrator, and it read as valid to him. That was the more important thing. And so I like that men like the books. And I have, everywhere I go, there's like a lot of men are like, we have something in common. And I'm thinking like, do we? I don't know, but.
Do they elaborate?
Sometimes they do, and it's a little scary. Yeah. That and the letters from prison.
Do you answer the letters from prison?
No.
That seems
I feel
wise.
terribly guilty about it too, because I think one should answer mail from prison. On the other hand.
Though not necessarily with the return address.
Yeah.
I'm curious about how you use this research that you do so exhaustively. I mean, is it atmosphere that kind of seeps in strange places, or do you methodically organize it for particular sections?
I think the first thing about what the sort of the result of the research is a kind of confidence in the subject matter, to be honest. So I feel like if I'm writing something that's set in a place that I don't know intimately, by learning a lot about it, I then build my confidence level up to sound believable on the subject. And then on a more practical level, it seeps in as fact. I mean, it seeps in as someone relaying information. You know, as I was saying in this book, the Harry is a Nixon scholar who loses his job because history is becoming more future forward and not so interested in the past, which concerns me. I mean, I think that's where we are. But there's a lot about Nixon that really is true, and in part comes from the fact that after Nixon left office, you know, there were enormous boxes, the White House special files that were seized. That information continues to be released. So I think what's interesting is that literally with that administration and all the subsequent ones, we see history continuing to sort of unpack itself. So I find that really fascinating, and those facts, you know, weave their way through the novel as, you know, as facts, sort of.
Do you do the research sort of contemporaneously to writing the novel, or do you?
I do it all. You know, it's funny to say I do it all the time. I'm the person who would go to bed with the World Book, and I would take a different letter to bed every night. Oh, tonight's H. It's going to be great with the acetates of the horses. You know, the horse anatomy. I love information. I love reference books.
Hi. I have actually read all 497 pages of May We Be Forgiven, and for those who haven't got a copy yet, it's amazing.
Thank you.
Really, I don't know how you top your previous books, but this one's amazing. And I love the Nixon stuff. I absolutely adore it. Many stories all told at one time. But I wanted to ask you, I don't know if people were picking up on the really intense enmeshment between Harry and his brother George, even in the section that you were reading.
Sure.
And I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit, and perhaps to the reliability or lack thereof of the narrator, Harry.
Well, I think of Harry as quite reliable. I mean, I think the thing about, just to say about that, which was interesting to me in writing this book, was when I started writing the book, I kept thinking, why is this so difficult in some way? And I felt like the book was resisting writing for a while. And I thought, that's just weird. And I worried, oh, I'm not into it, or like, what is this? And I realized that part of it was I was writing about a person who didn't know himself. So in a way, he couldn't tell me enough about himself in the beginning. And I somehow describe this book to people sometimes as a midlife coming-of-age book, because Harry actually sort of grows into the person that he kind of not just always wanted to be, that's too easy, but he becomes a person in a way that he'd been very sort of shut down before that, and very kind of not just repressed, but just non-existent. And so that was an interesting sort of evolution. But in terms of the relationship between the two brothers, I mean, I think of it really, you know, it's quasi-biblical. I mean, it's like Cain and Abel, and this very both intense competition, and, you know, clearly there's a peculiar kind of love that you know, George comes home and he whacks the wife on the head with a lamp and not his brother. And that interests me, you know, and that's, when you go back and look at Cheever's like Falconer or Goodbye, My Brother, you see that in there. And Cheever had a very interesting and complicated relationship with his brother Fred. And I don't know, just things like that just stick in my head, you know. And it's interesting, too, because it'll sometimes take me several books to fully sort of cycle around to what that exploration is. Like, you begin in This Book Will Save Your Life. There is a beginning of an unfolding of a relationship between two brothers, but I couldn't quite nail it at that point. So it's sort of in the background there. And then now in this one it comes out.
Well, Ms. Holmes, first, thank you. It was a wonderful reading. My question is, I like your style of the stream of consciousness, that very disassociated recitation that you do in your main character's voice. And kind of hearing that this one took you 7 years. Is it hard for you to edit, since you have so much to say?
Right.
And do you edit by putting things in or taking things out?
Both. I mean, I love editing. I really do. I love editors who really edit and really like go through stuff and mark things up. End of Alice took a whole year longer just because I was busy cutting it. And this one, weirdly, I never had this happen. I turned in this book and literally the manuscript was 600 pages and the editor read it. He goes, I think you need to add a little more. It's like, what? Yeah, and I felt literally by the end that there was just nothing even left. And I was like, all right, if I have to. You know, we talked about what that might be, and I won't give you I'll happily individually give you the details, but if anyone wants them. But,
I'm a little curious.
you know, well,
Is it a spoiler?
No, not really, but there's a scene where, trying to think how to do this last one. Somebody writes a letter and that person makes an appearance near the end of the book. Someone who's received something from the family, who comes back, and that came out it was a very sort of after the first draft idea. There's a bunch of things that kind of got written out a bit further. And I think part of it too is honestly, at a certain point when I was near the end, things were getting even, it's funny to say, I don't know how this happened, even more compressed, and the editor wanted there to be a little bit more sort of, you know, air in there. And we did some cutting, and I think honestly, I mean, the truth is what I read tonight is not exactly what's in the book, because I could show it to you. I cut all the time. I mean, I just, you know, by the time I'm actually done with this book tour, it'll be like a poem.
So you're still cutting
Oh, absolutely.
from what's in the book. That's so
Absolutely.
funny.
Yeah,
That's
no.
classic.
I could never read from the book.
That's so funny. That's a classic. Okay.
I think I can make myself heard from here without the microphone. Are you an only child or do you have siblings?
She has siblings,
How
right?
does the relationship with your siblings for this book?
The question was, am I an only child or do I have siblings? I will quickly answer and tell you that I'm adopted, so I am.
You're both.
I'm both. I am an only child and I have siblings.
You have so many, and you have done you judge so many prizes, and you have so many books that you have to read a year for everyone else. Do you have an aspiration for yourself in terms of what goals you want to achieve in your writing, or a vision for yourself in terms of what your goals are?
I used to. That's a good question. I really did used to. And I think that at this point, I mean, I think a lot about I want to write books that make people think. And at the same time, I want them to be entertained. And I want them to not look at my books, but to look at their lives and the lives of people around them and think about, I don't know, how that works. So, I mean, it's funny to say, it sounds, this is so not what anyone would expect the transgressive writer to say, I want to be inspirational. But in a way, I do. I mean, I want us to do better, you know, in some way. And maybe that's what I want for myself in some form.